99% of empaths never reach it. Not because they stop growing, not because they give up, but because they reach a certain level of development, a level that feels like arrival, that looks like healing, that produces a life that finally works, and they stop there. Permanently. Mistaking the ceiling for the destination. Carl Jung watched this happen across decades of clinical work and identified the exact mechanism that keeps sensitive people one stage below the most powerful form of their own development. It wasn't lack of effort. It wasn't unfinished healing. It was something far more specific and far more confronting. Because here is what makes this conversation different from most conversations about empaths and their potential. The Sophia stage is not the next level of being a better empath. It is not the reward for setting more boundaries or doing more healing work or accumulating more psychological insight. It is something that requires the empath to undergo a transformation so complete that the very framework through which they have understood themselves, including the framework of being an empath, has to be released entirely. And that is precisely why 99% never reach it. To understand what the Sophia stage actually is, you first have to understand what Sophia meant to Jung and why he chose this particular concept to describe what he was seeing. Sophia in the ancient world was not simply wisdom in the intellectual sense. She was not the accumulation of correct information or the sophisticated ability to analyze situations. In Gnostic tradition, in the wisdom literature Jung studied extensively, Sophia represented something closer to what happens when wisdom becomes embodied. When it stops being something a person knows and becomes something a person is. The distinction matters enormously, because the world is full of people who know wise things and live unwise lives, who can articulate profound truths about human nature while being completely unable to apply those truths to themselves, who have read every book, completed every course, built an impressive architecture of understanding, and remain at the center of all that understanding, fundamentally, unchanged. Sophia is what exists on the other side of that gap. It is wisdom that has traveled all the way down from the mind into the body, into the nervous system, into the automatic and instinctive responses that reveal what a person actually is, rather than what they have learned to say about themselves. Jung connected this specifically to empaths because he observed that sensitive people were uniquely positioned for this development and uniquely vulnerable to stopping just short of it. The very qualities that gave empaths access to depths of human experience that others couldn't reach, the permeability, the capacity for feeling, the attunement to undercurrents and unspoken truths, were the same qualities that, if not fully integrated, would keep them perpetually circling the Sophia stage without ever entering it. The empath's journey toward Sophia passes through territory that is genuinely difficult to map, because most of the signposts look, from the outside, like the destination. There are multiple stages that feel like arrival and are actually preparation. Understanding which stage you're in, and being honest about it, is the first requirement of actually moving forward. The earliest stage most empaths inhabit is one Jung called undifferentiated feeling. This is the empath in their original, unexamined form. They feel everything, but they cannot yet distinguish between what belongs to them and what belongs to the environment. Their emotional life is a continuous incoming tide of data from every direction, and they have no reliable way to sort it. They are extraordinarily attuned and extraordinarily overwhelmed in equal measure. Their sensitivity is fully active and completely unmastered. They are a receiving instrument with no volume control and no ability to determine the source of what they're receiving. This stage, while painful, is not the problem. It is the beginning of something, the raw material of a development that, if engaged with honestly, becomes the foundation of something remarkable. The problem comes in how empaths typically respond to the pain of this stage and what identities they construct in response to it. The second stage is what Jung observed as the most populated one, the stage where most empaths spend most of their lives. He described it as conscious sensitivity, and it represents genuine progress from the first stage. The empath here has awareness. They know they are sensitive. They have language for their experience. They understand the dynamics of absorption and projection and codependency and narcissistic relationship patterns. They have built, often through considerable effort and pain, a framework for understanding what happens to them and why. But here is what Jung noticed with precise and somewhat uncomfortable clarity about this stage. The framework, however sophisticated, is still organized around the empath as someone to whom things happen. The sensitivity is still understood primarily through the lens of its cost. The healing work being done is still fundamentally reactive, responding to, recovering from, protecting against. The empath in this stage has graduated from being unconsciously overwhelmed to being consciously overwhelmed with better coping strategies, which is real progress. But it is not the Sophia stage, not even close. The third stage is rarer and more genuinely significant. Jung described it as the stage of earned boundaries, and the word earned is doing critical work in Jungian, that phrase. These are not the fearful boundaries of the second stage, set from exhaustion and the desperate need for protection. These are boundaries that have emerged from a genuine and stable knowledge of the self. The empath in this stage has developed enough interior solidity that they can choose their engagement rather than simply defending against the consequences of having no choice. They can be in a room full of emotional noise and not be defined by it. They have agency in their empathic experience in a way that earlier stages never permitted. Most people who talk about healed empaths are describing this third stage, and it is genuinely valuable. It is a life that works. It is a version of the empath's gifts functioning without the crushing weight that the earlier stages demanded. Jung respected it as a real achievement, but he also identified exactly what separates this stage from the Sophia stage. And it is a distinction that is subtle enough that most people in the third stage never notice it, because the third stage empath, for all their growth, is still operating from a fundamentally personal center. Their wisdom is still essentially about themselves. Their awareness, however sophisticated, is still organized around their own healing, their own development, their own navigation of their own experience. The self, even a well-developed and genuinely healthy self, is still the central reference point for everything. The Sophia stage asks for the dissolution of that centrality. This is where the 99% stop. Not because they are defeated, not because they haven't worked hard enough or healed enough or developed enough insight, but because what the Sophia stage requires is the one thing that the ego, any ego, even a well-integrated and psychologically sophisticated ego, cannot willingly hand over. It requires the end of the self as the primary axis around which understanding rotates. Jung described what happens in the people who cross this threshold using language that is difficult to translate into psychological terminology because it is fundamentally experiential. He said these individuals underwent what he called depersonalization of wisdom. Their understanding of human experience stopped being organized around their own experience of being human and became something more like a direct perception of the nature of human experience itself. They could hold their own story, including all its pain, all its formative weight, without being the story. They could be fully present in their own life without being imprisoned by the perspective of the one living it. The practical difference this creates is visible to anyone who spends time with someone in this stage, even if they cannot name what they're responding to. There is a quality of attention these people offer that is unlike ordinary attention. When they listen to you, they are not simultaneously processing how what you're saying relates to their own experience, not building a response, not waiting for the part of your story that resonates with theirs. They are simply and completely receiving you. And in that reception, in that complete absence of agenda in the listening, something happens to the person being listened to. They feel seen in a way that produces a very specific response. Not comfort exactly, something more clarifying than comfort. A sense of suddenly being slightly more real to themselves than they were before the conversation. This quality is what Jung was pointing at when he used the word Sophia. It is wisdom that has become so fully integrated that it no longer announces itself, no longer performs itself, no longer needs to be recognized as wisdom. It is simply what happens when someone is in the room. But the path to it runs directly through territory that the empath's psychology is specifically designed to avoid. Because the Sophia stage requires the complete integration of what Jung called the shadow. And for empaths, the shadow contains material that is particularly Confronting. The empath shadow is not primarily darkness in the way most people imagine shadow. It is not hidden cruelty or suppressed rage, though those can be present. The empath's shadow tends to contain something more specific and more surprising. It contains their will, their desire for power in the non-corrupted sense, the genuine desire to affect the world according to their own vision rather than in response to others' needs, their capacity for indifference, for the clean and legitimate not caring that is not callousness but is sovereignty, their ability to prioritize themselves without the machinery of guilt running in the background generating justification for the choice. Empaths tend to have these qualities deeply buried because they learned early that their value was located in their attunement to others. That to be focused on their own needs and desires was to betray the thing that made them worthy of belonging, so the will went underground. The desire for power over their own life, real power, not just the performance of healthy selfhood, got classified as dangerous and kept in the shadow. And because it was never integrated, it continued to operate from there, leaking out as passive resistance, as the exhaustion that is not really exhaustion, but is unexpressed refusal, as the resentment that accumulates in relationships where the empath gives what they do not genuinely want to give and cannot admit it, as the subtle self-sabotage of the person who is afraid of what they might become if they stopped organizing their life around the feelings of everyone around them. The Sophia stage requires the empath to go into the shadow and retrieve what is there, not to become selfish, not to abandon the empathy that is genuinely theirs, but to become whole in a way that requires the parts they have exiled to be brought back into the full inhabitation of who they are, to claim the will alongside the compassion, the ferocity alongside the gentleness, the capacity for sovereign indifference alongside the capacity for profound connection. This integration is not a single event. It does not happen in a weekend, workshop, or a particularly illuminating therapy session, though both of those can contribute to the conditions in which it becomes possible. It happens gradually over years through the accumulation of choices to not look away from what is actually there, to not perform the empath identity when the performance requires the suppression of what is genuinely being felt, to not default, to caregiving when what is actually present is something less flattering and more honest. Jung observed something specific about what happens to empaths who enter this integration process sincerely. They become, for a period, less recognizably themselves to the people around them. The predictable gentleness becomes less predictable. The reliable availability becomes less reliable. People who have organized their relationship with the empath around the empath's consistent self-effacement find that consistency suddenly and disoriently absent, and this produces pressure. Social pressure, relational pressure, the specific pressure that comes from people who preferred you as you were, and have both conscious and unconscious means of communicating that preference. This pressure is the final test before the Sophia stage. Because the Sophia stage cannot be entered by someone who is still fundamentally organized around the responses of other people. The dissolution of the self as central axis requires, first, a period of being genuinely willing to disappoint. 2. Be misunderstood. To be experienced as having changed in ways that others did not request and do not endorse. To hold your own direction under the weight of relationships that were calibrated to the earlier version of you and have not yet recalibrated. Most empaths, even empaths deep in their development, find this pressure sufficient to reverse the integration, not dramatically, not through a conscious decision to go back, just through the gradual accumulation of small concessions. The anger that gets swallowed because expressing it would create a conflict the empath decides isn't worth having. The boundary that gets softened because the other person's disappointment is too familiar a feeling to sit with. The authentic response that gets edited back into the expected one because the expected one is simply less costly in the short term. These concessions accumulate invisibly until the empath looks up and finds themselves once again slightly behind their own life, slightly not there. The ones who do not reverse, the rare ones who hold their direction through the discomfort of others' adjustment, who tolerate the relational friction without resolving it prematurely by returning to the old patterns, These are the ones Jung watched move into the Sophia stage, and what he observed when they arrived was consistent in a specific way. They did not become wise in the way people imagine wisdom. They did not become serene and somewhat removed, offering guidance from a settled and elevated place. They became, paradoxically, more fully human, more completely in contact with the specific texture of lived experience, more capable of being genuinely moved by beauty, by suffering, by the ordinary complexity of being alive, without being destabilized by the moving. They had developed what Jung described as the capacity to hold paradox without needing it to resolve, to be simultaneously certain and humble, to care completely and hold lightly, to be fully present in their own life while being genuinely available to the life of another, to feel the full weight of human experience without that weight requiring them to organize their entire existence around managing it. This is the Sophia stage, not a destination at which you arrive and subsequently remain, but a quality of relationship with your own existence that, once genuinely accessed, changes the texture of everything. The way you move through conflict, the way you inhabit silence, the way you experience the ordinary moments that make up the actual content of a life. If you are an empath deep in your development, somewhere in the third stage with the kind of self-awareness that has come from genuine work over real time, there is something worth sitting with after everything I've said. The Sophia stage is not further along the path you are currently on. It is not more of what you are already doing. It is not the completion of your current healing framework, but the transcendence of it. The point at which the empath identity itself, the story of being the sensitive one, the one who feels everything, the one who has done the work, has to be released with the same willingness that every earlier identity was released. Not because it was false, not because the journey it organized didn't matter, but because every identity, however true it once was, eventually becomes the ceiling if you refuse to let it become the floor. The Sophia stage is what exists when there is no longer a story about the kind of person you are, just the actual, specific, unrepeatable person, present, whole, no longer becoming, finally, completely, here.